Hello everyone, this is the Theoretical Doctor and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, welcome. This is a series on the chapter Gaseous Exchange of Chapter 1 of the STPM Semester 2 Biology series. Check out the full playlist on my channel. If you want to access flashcards on this topic and other videos, do click the link below. It is available on my Pinterest and slides on this topic are available on my website. In this video, we will be starting on the respiratory system in humans. Here are some of the subtopics we will be focusing on: the human respiratory system, the structure of alveolus, the alveolar-capillary barrier, and the mechanism of ventilation. The human respiratory system. The human respiratory system begins with the nasal or buccal cavities. So basically when we inhale air, we either inhale through the nose or through the mouth. So if it's through the nose, it's through the nasal cavity. If it's through the mouth, it's through the buccal cavity, which will then lead the air into the pharynx, into the larynx, and into the trachea, into the bronchi, into the bronchioles, and finally into the alveoli, where gaseous exchange occurs. So just a little function of each of these. So for the nasal cavity, it warms and moistens and also filters the air. So when you were to breathe in, first the air will be warmed, moistened, and the hairs that's present in our nose, it will filter the air. So there are presence of cilia to prevent large particles from entering the lungs. And eventually these large particles will collect, and that's where you get bogus in your nose or dirt in your nose. Next will be the pharynx. So the pharynx serves to connect the nasal and the oral cavity into the larynx, this part here. Over here, the larynx, it contains vocal cords for sound production. So like now I'm speaking, or if you were to sing, that's where the vocal cords are present. After that, it will move into the trachea. So this trachea, it allows the passage of air from the trachea into the bronchioles. So this part here is the bronchi, and then it will branch out into bronchioles. So there is C-shaped cartilage rings of the trachea, and this allows the continuous movement of air through air passage. Inside here, there will be goblet cells. So these goblet cells will secrete mucus, and this mucus will trap dust particles or microbial spores. So some parts here which are not filtered in the nasal cavity, it might end up in the trachea. So in the trachea, there will be further filtering to prevent these particles from moving into the lungs. So sometimes the person may cough up and there's phlegm. It's actually from the mucus over here, the mucus production over here. So from the trachea, it will branch out into the bronchi, left and right bronchi. And the function of the bronchi is to allow passage of air from the trachea to the bronchioles. Now in the bronchioles, it functions to allow passage of air from the bronchi to the alveoli. These tiny sacs over here, these are the alveoli. And the alveoli serves to function where the gaseous exchange occur. Alright, so this is basically what I talked about. So you can pause the video over here to read up again on the functions of each part. Now let's move on to the structure of alveolus. So I'll be talking about a few parts here, but we will begin with the epithelium of the alveoli. So the common knowledge that we have of alveoli is that it is one cell thick. Now it's not wrong, but it's not complete. So actually the alveoli consist of two types of cells. These two types of cells are called type 1 pneumocytes and type 2 pneumocytes. Pneumo meaning lungs and cytes meaning cells. Pneumo, lung, cyte, cells. Hence, the cells in the lungs are referred to as pneumocytes. Okay, so for type 1 pneumocytes, it comprises up to about 95 to 97% of the epithelium of the alveoli. It is large, thin, flattened, simple squamous cells. So type 1 pneumocytes are simple squamous cells, and they form the thin barrier between the alveoli and the blood capillary. The main function is to allow gaseous exchange to occur. So it just functions as a barrier, whereby there is a barrier but it's still thin enough for gaseous exchange to occur, meaning carbon dioxide and oxygen can still diffuse through. After that, you have type 2 pneumocytes. So type 2 pneumocytes makes up the remaining 3 to 5%, and they're made up of simple cuboidal cells. So they have two functions over here. The first one, it acts as reserve cells to differentiate into new squamous cells whenever it is needed. So type 2 pneumocytes, they can become type 1 pneumocytes. So remember, type 1 pneumocytes are simple squamous cells, function to allow gaseous exchange. Type 2 pneumocytes are simple cuboidal cells, and they act as reserve cells, meaning they can differentiate, they can become type 1 pneumocyte. That's the first function. The second function is to secrete surfactant on the interior lining of the alveoli to decrease surface tension, which prevents the alveoli from collapsing during exhalation. So this surfactant is like oil basically. It will keep secreting surfactant so that there is some liquid over there. So when there is exhalation, the alveoli will contract, it will become small. So to prevent it from collapsing so that it can later on stretch and then contract, stretch and contract, you need some lining, some oil inside there so it doesn't just contract and stop. So this surfactant is very important actually, and it is reduced in prematurely born babies. So premature born babies are those babies born less than 9 months, and especially it's seen in babies who are born through emergency birth. But nowadays they do give injections of steroids to the mother before delivery if they have to deliver the baby prematurely. Hence, when the baby is born prematurely, they tend to develop difficulty breathing. Sometimes this happens over the years, and they may suffer from asthma until adulthood. So this is a good way to remember the functions of type 2 pneumocytes. So again, remember there are two types of epithelium: type 1 pneumocytes, type 2 pneumocytes. And type 2 pneumocytes produces two cell types. Why it produces two cell types? It's made up of simple cuboidal cells, and it can differentiate into simple squamous cells, and they have two functions: reserve cells, and also function to secrete surfactant. Apart from the epithelium, you have macrophages, elastic fibers, and blood capillaries. Macrophages, they phagocyte foreign materials such as microorganisms and dust particles. So some particles, they can still go through the nasal cavity, they can still bypass through the trachea, and they end up in the alveoli. So these macrophages will actually just phagocyte, eat them up. And then you have the elastic fibers. It allows the optimum extension during inhalation. So it allows the alveoli to completely expand during inhalation and allows the alveoli to recoil during exhalation. Basically, it serves like a rubber band. Otherwise, they would be start either being too enlarged, too big, and this is seen in people suffering from COPD. So COPD is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and you usually see these in older patients, usually with history of many years of smoking or chronic smoking. And finally, the blood capillaries to oxygenate the blood and remove the carbon dioxide. Alright, moving on, the alveolar-capillary barrier. So the alveolar-capillary barrier consists of these four. First is the epithelium of the alveoli. So the epithelium of the alveoli, and then the basement membrane of the alveolar membrane, and then the basement membrane of the blood capillary, and the endothelium of the blood capillary. So over here, you have the epithelium of the alveoli, and then you have the basement membrane of the alveoli, and the basement membrane of the blood capillary, and finally the endothelium of the blood capillary. So epithelium of the alveoli basically is the cell of the alveoli. So this is followed by the basement membrane, and the basement membrane is actually where the epithelium or the cell grows. So if you see there's a cell, there's the epithelium or the endothelium, just remember that it has to grow from somewhere. So it grows from the basement membrane. That's why it's epithelium first, and then the basement membrane, and then the basement membrane, and finally the endothelium. Now is the mechanism of respiration or ventilation. So the mechanism comprises of two actions: inspiration or expiration. In terms of describing the inspiration and expiration processes, these 7 words are all you need to describe the full process. So here's the sequence. First, you talk about a muscle, and you comment on the external and the internal intercostal muscles. What do they do? Talk about the rib cage. Talk about the diaphragm and the thoracic volume, the air pressure, what's it like inside the lungs, the movement of the air, is it coming in or out of the lungs, and finally the volume of the lungs, did it increase or decrease? So let's begin with inspiration. In inspiration, the internal intercostal muscle relax and the external intercostal muscles contract. During inspiration, we breathe in air. And when you breathe in air, obviously, air enters the lungs and it needs to expand. So in order for that to expand, the external intercostal muscles have to contract. So when they contract, they force the rib cage to move up. Okay, so just remember this. During inspiration, the external intercostal muscles contract. So when it contracts, it pulls the rib cage out, and the internal intercostal muscles have to relax. So when this happens, the rib cage move upwards and outwards to make space for the air coming in. Then the diaphragm muscles will contract. So when they contract, they become flat and they move downwards. So now you have the rib cage moving up and out, you have the external intercostal muscles contracted, and you have the diaphragm contracted, flattened, and moved downwards. So what happens is the thoracic volume increases. This part here, okay? The thoracic volume increases. So air pressure inside decreases, because when the volume increases, the pressure decreases. Now when the pressure over here decreases, air moves into the lungs. Since the air pressure inside the lungs is lower than the atmospheric pressure, so the air over here is lower than the outside air, the air will move from a higher gradient to a lower gradient. So air moves into the lungs. What happens to the volume of the lungs? Well, since air moved into the lungs, the volume of the lungs increases. So that's for inspiration. Now how about expiration? During expiration, we need to exhale air. We need to remove air. Okay, so follow this sequence again. So for expiration, now the external intercostal muscles relax and the internal intercostal muscles contract. So when it contracts, it pulls, right? Contracts basically means to become small, so it pulls. So during expiration, you want to force air to come out. So the inside muscle has to pull it in. That's why the internal intercostal muscles contract and the external intercostal muscles relax. What happens to the rib cage? The rib cage moves downwards and inwards, and the diaphragm over here, they relax, so they become a dome shape and they move upwards. What about the thoracic volume? Well, you need to push air out. Obviously, the thoracic volume decreases. And what about the air pressure? You need to force air out. So the air pressure inside the thoracic cavity will increase, because when volume decreases, the air pressure increases. So how about the movement of air? The air moves out of the lungs. Since the air pressure inside the lungs is higher than the atmospheric pressure, meaning the air inside here is higher than outside air, air will move out of the lungs. And what happened to the volume of the lungs? Well, since air moved out of the lungs, the volume of the lungs decreases. So just go through again. These are the sequence that you need to explain the whole mechanism of respiration or ventilation. And this is basically what I explained earlier. It's just a comparison. So you can pause the video here and go through again if you need to rewind a bit. And yep, so if you've reached this point, thank you very much. Hit the like button if you found it helpful, as it does help in reaching out to others as well. Do support my channel by pressing the subscribe button so I will know, and it gives me motivation to continue producing content like this in the future. And finally, share this video to those who might find this helpful. See you in the next one.